All right, hello everyone. So this is my literature review, and it's about adults versus children in second language acquisition. The purpose of this literature review is to answer three questions about second language acquisition, which we'll refer to as SLA. The first question is, what is SLA, and how does one acquire a second language? Why do adults struggle to acquire a second language compared to children? And then the last question is, what can be done to counteract this imbalance? So I did some background, talking a little bit about background research. This topic has been researched quite a lot by linguists, along with teachers of ESL, especially focused on the critical period, which we'll kind of get into later. But it's been a very important topic in ESL because of how important it can be for students. So a lot of that research, again, has been done by linguists along with ESL teachers. For my research, since this is a literature review, I focus solely on reviewing literature that has already been published on this topic. I worked with 6 different pieces, which again will be listed in the bibliography, and I will mention throughout this literature review. Um, I specifically wanted to look at not only what the differences are between adults and children, but also theories as to why those differences might exist, and what can be done by teachers to help counteract those differences and make the playing field more level for students. Um, so the first question I kind of want to answer is, what is a second language? To put it the most plainly, as Pringanti says in their piece, which is a kind of basic overview of the differences between adults and children in SLA. A second language is a language that you learn after your first language has been acquired, um, which kind of makes sense in the name. And while that may seem obvious, it is an important detail to note, as we will see later on. And then we kind of want to look at, how does one acquire a second language? Again, Pringanti discusses this, saying that unlike our first language, which humans learn innately from birth, a second language is more consciously acquired, um, either through learning or acquisition. Now, in the book by Van Patten and Williams, which is a guidebook for theories in SLA, giving an overview and introduction to, I would say, most of the theories in SLA, both older and newer. The author discusses Krashen's monitor theory, um, specifically the acquisition learning hypothesis within monitor theory. Um, this hypothesis states that acquisition occurs naturally outside of consciousness, such as like when you're speaking with a native speaker in the L2, or listening to someone, while learning is more a conscious occurs more consciously, where we learn specific grammar rules like in a classroom. In this hypothesis, the author, Van Patten and Williams, they also state that um, Krashen's theorized that these two types of knowledge can never interact, um, and this caused Krashen's to argue that to best achieve fluency in L2, learners and teachers should favor a more acquisition based teaching and learning style, such as like the audio lingual method, over other types of learning, because that acquisition is considered more conducive to language, to SLA. Now that kind of brings us into this question of acquisition versus learning. While Krashen's argued for more acquisition-centered teaching methods, there are many people that don't agree. The article by Asubel was a specific argument against that style of learning, for adult learners specifically. In this piece, the author states that while the audiolingual method does work for children, it doesn't work for adults, and that the author argues that rather than use an audiolingual method, we should use methods that are more conducive to adult learning, um, for adult learners, which would make sense. Um, the author argues that we should allow adult learners to use their native language to help mediate learning in L2, so they can take advantage of what they already know in their native language. Um, the author also argues that we should, um, take advantage of the written form, as that style of learning is what many adult learners are used to, especially learners from other countries such as China, where they're oftentimes spend a lot of time being drilled and just reading books and reading notes and listening. They're very used to this kind of style of learning. And so it might be more conducive to kind of keep them comfortable with the method. Um, but with that, we kind of have to wonder why do adults and children need different teaching methods? Why can't we just use the same methods for adults and for children? Um, Really, we have to look at the differences. Um, and for this, I found most of my data in the piece by Major. In Major's piece, which is a in-depth overview of a study performed by Major. Um, in this study, she surveyed multiple age groups, 10 to 19, 20 to 29, 30 to 39, and over 40 of non-native English speakers. Giving them multiple tests along with survey questions concerning demographic, affective, and cognitive factors, um, and compared them to the scores of native English speakers. The study was done not only to highlight that there are differences in English proficiency among the age groups, but also to find out why those differences exist, as well as which factors contribute the most to those differences. So this is a really in-depth study. I pulled a lot of information from this. It's really good. Um, so going into that, the biggest difference I found in that piece by Major was that no one above the age of 19 was able to score at or above a native English speaker's score on the test that Major gave. Even then, the only two people in the 10 to 19 group who were able to score at or above a native English speakers were aged 11 and 12, so they're prepubescent. No one past that kind of puberty range was able to score close to a native English speaker's score. Um, what this kind of points out is that while children can acquire a second language at native proficiency, adults in most cases are not able to. Now, you know, you can't say that it's not possible because there is standout cases, but for the most part, adults are not able to achieve that native proficiency like these younger children are. The other differences that Major points out is that the students who were considered the most motivated and who used the second language the most often tended to score the highest in their age group. Even above education, while students who did have a higher education did tend to score higher, students who were motivated and who used the L2 the most often tended to score the highest within their age group, um, all other factors aside. Um, and then, now, with that being said, now that we kind of know the differences, we have to look into why these differences exist. Um, in the piece by Major, again, the biggest reason for the differences is age. Um, Now, the kind of reason that age is such a big difference is that it's discussed in the piece by Krashens. Um, in this book, Krashens comments on the results of 12 different studies done on age differences in SLA, discussing the best age for second language acquisition. Um, Krashens also discusses the effects of different teaching methods and other factors in SLA. And in this book, he points out that the most important factor in SLA is the critical period, um, also called the sensitive period. Um, the critical period, for those of you that don't know, is a two-part process from birth to age 6 and then 6 to puberty, where the human brain is considered the most flexible or most like malleable. Um, and it's the point where our brains can absorb the most knowledge. Um, the author Krashen states that while older learners may be able to pick up on language faster early on, those who learn a second language during that critical period will achieve higher proficiency. And this is reflected in the results done by Major, as well as in my own work. I've worked with students who are prepubescent, like up to third grade. I've also worked with college students and adult students. And what I found is that my students that I've worked with who were in that kind of pre pubescent area were able to achieve native fluency, but no student I've worked with that's been above that age is fluent, as fluent as a native. I actually had some students who I worked with who were twins from Russia, and they came to the school I work at knowing no English in kindergarten. they're third graders now, and if someone had not told me that they were non-native English speakers, I would have never known. Their English is as perfect as a native speaker for their age. So it just shows that if you learn a language during that critical period, as pointed out by Crashens, as pointed out by Major, you can really gain that native proficiency. But those who learn it past the critical period, just it's not really possible. Um, and this is further corroborated in the article by Ghazali. In this article, the author studies the differences between first language acquisition and second language acquisition, looking at different factors such as age, motivation, and teaching styles, and how they affect FLA, first language acquisition, and SLA. And then, as Krashens found, this author also states that age difference is the biggest difference between adults and children, and that while adults can pick up on language more easily than children early on due to higher cognitive development, being able to like read and understand things a little bit better. They will never be able to learn a language with as high of proficiency as those who learn a second language during that critical period, which again is exactly what Major stated in her study. Um, Now, this is we have to wonder, how do we counteract this imbalance? How do we make it fair for everyone? Um, and this is something that none of the pieces really outright discussed, but there's some implied answers throughout all of them. I think the only one that really kind of like discussed it was Ausubel, but even then, that was a very like specific argument for one person, and not everyone can agree. So I'm going to give like a more general way to counteract this imbalance, and which this is as pointed out in the last few panels. Once the critical period has passed, there is no going back, meaning that adult learners will not be able to gain the same proficiency as those who learned a second language during the critical period. Um, what we can do to counteract it is focus on the strength of our learners. We can take advantage of the fact that they are adults and teach them topics that children may not be able to comprehend. That's like one of the biggest things we can do. We can also differentiate to help take advantage of each of our learners' individual strengths. And again, that's huge. Differentiating can help our learners so much. We can also work to keep our learners motivated. As we saw in this test by Major, this is one of the most influential factors in SLA. Um, and by keeping the classroom engaging and exciting, it'll keep our learners motivated, and they will learn that language faster, and they'll pick up on it better. Um, and then finally, we can make sure our learners are using the language by providing them ample opportunities to speak and be spoken to. Again, as pointed out in the test in the research by Major, um, students who use the language more tend to retain the language a lot better, and tend to score higher. So if we allow our learners to use the language more, that's going to help them in the long run. In conclusion, we've answered all of our three questions. Second language acquisition is the conscious acquiring or learning of a second language. We either learn a second language consciously, such as in a classroom setting, or acquire it unconsciously through more natural settings. Um, Adults struggle more than children in SLA, predominantly due to age, as once a critical period has passed, the learner can no longer achieve native or near native proficiency. Other factors include motivation, education, and language usage. Though none of these factors can trump age. Um, and while we can't change the age factor, we can best counteract this imbalance by taking advantage of our learner's skill, both through age and individual differences, by keeping our learners motivated and by making sure our learners are using the language regularly. This will give our learners, both children and adults, the best chance for success in SLA. And with that, here's my bibliography. So the language review is, or sorry, literature review is complete. Thanks for listening and have a great day.